Hey, everybody. We talk a lot about the future of business on Punk Rock HR, but it's hard to look forward when you're stuck in the past, especially if your payroll and HR systems are there too. That's why I'm so excited to tell you about Intuit QuickBooks Payroll. QuickBooks isn't just accounting software. QuickBooks Payroll is your command center that connects payroll, time tracking, HR, and your financials in one place. Get real visibility into every dollar, every hour. No juggling systems or passwords. Since QuickBooks Payroll connects payroll, time, and accounting, you get a full financial picture and can make smarter decisions on the fly with full visibility. Stop letting outdated systems hold you back. Build the future of work your way. Learn more today at quickbooks.com/payroll.
RepCap is proud to support Punk Rock HR. We're B2B content marketing consultants that combine a journalist's curiosity with a marketer's creativity to tell clear, human stories that connect. From strategy to execution, we partner with brands to turn ideas into thought leadership and get real results. Want to learn more? Head over to repcap.com.
What I've begun to understand was the impact of loneliness and social connection. Loneliness on the downside, equivalent to smoking 15 cigarettes a day, and the importance of social connection, intergenerational connection, having a network that supports you can really positively impact your healthy longevity. And that's the thing that has actually driven me the last few years to both report on and try to understand why social connection is declining here and how we can reverse that.
Hey, everybody. I'm Lori Rudiman. Welcome to Punk Rock HR. My guest this week is Ken Stern. Ken is a longevity expert and the author of Healthy to 100, a Wall Street Journal Best Book of the Year. Ken studied the longest lived countries in the world, like Japan, Singapore, Italy, Spain. And what he found is that living longer has very little to do with your diet or your gym routine. It's about your relationships, your social connections, the people in your life, and how invested you are in each other. So if you're thinking about what the back half of your life could look like, well, this conversation is worth your time. So sit back and enjoy my talk with Ken Stern right here on Punk Rock HR. Hey, Ken, welcome to the show.
Hi, Lori. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, well, repeat guest. I love to see it. It's really wonderful that you didn't get too bruised the first time you were here. So thanks for coming back.
Not too bad. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, listen, before we get started, why don't you tell everybody who you are and what you're all about?
So that's a big question. I'm Ken Stern. I am the chair of something called the Longevity Project, which fosters greater understanding around the role and consequences of longer life and how we can rethink our lives for better, healthier, and more equitable lives. And I'm the author, most recently, of Healthy to 100, How Strong Social Ties Lead to Longer Lives, which is my new book out for the last couple months.
Yeah, it's a great book. We're going to talk about it. You know, you've had an interesting career journey to this moment today where you are on some rando punk rock HR podcast, but you do come from a place of wisdom and knowing what real life is like. You're not just writing books about it. You had a corporate career. Can you tell us about that?
Well, I've had a varied career. I'm 62 now, and I say varied, and others may say idiosyncratic. I'm a lawyer by training, spent time in the law, spent time in politics, spent time in media. I ran NPR for about 10 years. And then I went off on my own to write books, do podcasts, write newsletters. But in the last 7 years, really explore this world of longevity, how we're going to have a longer lived and healthier society, and some of the challenges we have right now, especially compared to some of the other countries around the world.
Well, tell me why that topic interests you, because you have this varied career. You've seen the world of work. You've seen lives lived. Why longevity?
So let's face it. I got interested in aging because I started getting older.
Yeah, you and me both.
Yeah. But I got interested in longevity because I met a woman named Laura Carstensen, who's the founder of the Sanford Center on Longevity. And I met her about 7 years ago. I thought we were going to talk about aging, which is most people think of as, what do we do with all these old people? And she wanted to talk about longevity. It's like, how do we reinvent the life course for longer, healthier lives that We've more or less doubled life expectancy in the last 125 years, one of the greatest achievements of the 20th century, and yet we still live our lives as if that hadn't happened. And how do we rethink it? What she calls the new map of life. And that was, for me, sort of one of these aha, pivotal moments that really got me interested in rethinking everything from about how we age, because how we age actually starts when we're born, actually starts before we're born. Some of the most pivotal moments in healthy longevity are the first moments of our lives.
Yeah. One of the things I learned from you and from your early work is that I think, fate is determined so often by our zip code. So that was an aha moment for me. What are some of the interesting things that you've learned about the impact on our lives and longevity?
So one of the things you just said is actually fundamental and unfair. So where we're born and where we live has an enormous impact in how wealthy we are. So for instance, I'm in DC. If I lived in Georgetown, which I don't, but not too far away, my life expectancy would be 92 on average. If I live in Anacostia, about 8 miles away, as the crow flies, my life expectancy would be 67. And those small differences, in the grand scheme of things, of where we're born and who we're born to and where we grew up, have a defining impact on our lives. So that's one sort of, I think, boundary condition. The other thing that really actually drove me to write this book was beginning to understand the impact of social connection and loneliness on how we age. I think if you'd asked me 3 years ago, 4 years ago, what are the things beyond income that really affect sort of on an individual basis? I would have probably said what most Americans say: nutrition, exercise, weight, things like that, which are all important, even genetics. But what I've begun to understand, starting with some reporting I did actually in Texas, was the impact of loneliness and social connection. Loneliness on the downside, equivalent to smoking 15 cigarettes a day, and the importance of social connection, intergenerational connection, having a network that supports you, can really positively impact your healthy longevity. And that's the thing that has actually driven me the last few years to both report on and try to understand why social connection is declining here and how we can reverse that.
Yeah. There's a lot of talk around social connection, and I'm so glad you're doing the work and you're writing this book. And I think it's one of those things like we pay lip service to in our society. And I just wonder, why is it so difficult to have a meaty, meaningful, policy-driven discussion around social connection?
Yeah, so I think I think you're absolutely right. So I think of social connection, loneliness as sort of like the weather. Everyone talks about it, no one does anything about it. I think it's because here, I would say in other places, and this is really what I report in my book, social health is part of public health and really is baked into public policy about how we're supposed to live our lives as we age.
Give me an example of that. Where is that happening and how does it make a difference?
So let me give you a few examples. So let's start with Korea, where the opportunity for lifelong learning is a constitutional right. Right? That's sort of an odd thing. Here we have rights to have soldiers quartered in our house. There is a constitutional right to lifelong learning. So they build systems in the universities, in what they call lifelong learning cities, that give people as they age the opportunity to really go into classrooms within a 10-minute walk of where they live. And that's a social norm that you continue to learn, not just for work, but just for for civic engagement and for personal health as you age. So that's one example. And here's another one. So Singapore, which is like a crazy place about about social connection, it's actually baked into housing policy. So it's a little bit different than here. The government owns about 90% of the housing stock. So they give precedence and priority to people who want to live close to family or with family. If you want a new apartment, there's all sorts of incentives to live close to your family. They don't build senior housing anymore. They build intergenerational housing, all things to do with keeping the generations and connected and old people as they age, socially connected, having purpose and meaning as they age. So that's really a civic engagement that you see in a bunch of countries, and I can go on, but you don't see here because it's really not understood as when people talk to me about social connection. I actually write an advice column on it now called Ask Ken. People still think of it as their individual responsibilities. Like, how can I, the most common question I get is, how can I, as an introvert, become socially connected? And that's because we continue to think of it as something that is an individual responsibility, not something that we need to sort of gauge in as a society, and how to create the framework and the opportunity for people to be more actively engaged with each other.
Hey, this is William Tincup, and you should know about the You Should Know podcast. It's a topical, fun podcast with Ryan, myself, and a guest, or guests plural sometimes, and we tackle the most timely topics of the day. Give it a look, give it a listen, and subscribe. Thanks.
Well, that's a tough conversation to have because you're right. The fabric of American society and really of growing Western society is this rugged individualism and this burden that we put on people to do everything alone. And, oftentimes people who do come to America are first generation or second or third, but they've got this recent memory, even if it's just in their DNA, of being the first and being the only, right? And so I think, how do you change policy? How do you change a conversation when recent success was built on this rugged individualism? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I think that's both true and not so true, Lori. So it is definitely true. There's definitely an American ideal, both of youth, an exaltation of youth, and the notion that we're supposed to go it alone. But it's not true that if you actually flip the clock back, not very long ago, maybe 100 years, which may seem like a long time, but in this vast scope of sort of humanness, not very long. We didn't actually have that sort of same view of the world. People lived in family units, mostly on the farm, right? The idea of this nuclear family where people are supposed to leave the house at 18 or 21 just didn't exist. That was not part of the culture. That was an invention of the early 20th century when we invented things like modern urban society. We invented the teenage years, which didn't really, that concept of teenage didn't exist. So we created all these new rules. We created the concept that we're supposed to retire at 65. None of those things existed before. They're all modern inventions, and we just treat them as inevitable when they largely have sort of specific historical reasons that don't longer apply. So what we created, we can also change.
That is so wise. You're absolutely right. So as you're writing this book, you're exploring the hidden costs societally and emotionally of, being disconnected in the world, the impact on longevity. What are some of the other lessons or stories that you'd like to share with us today?
So for the book, I actually traveled to 5 longer-lived countries. I mentioned already Singapore, South Korea, Japan, Spain, and Italy. Japan, I think, is actually a remarkable case study. Japan's the longest-lived country in the world if you don't count Monaco, which I don't. Only 40,000 people, so it's
That's like a suburb of Chicago. Yeah.
Exactly. So, and just to give you a sense of the median life expectancy for women now is 90 in Japan. I mean, so it means like if a woman dies at 89, you don't say that's a good long life. You say bad luck. I mean, it's really sort of an extraordinary change. And that's a lot longer than we live here. They've had, because they're a super age society, they've actually had to reinvent sort of the life course. And one of the things they've done is rethink the idea of how and when we work. So Japan is also the country in which more people work past 65 than any other country as a percentage. And they do that because, not because people need the money, though sometimes they do, but because they believe that work gives them purpose, it creates social connection, it gives them reason to get up in the morning. And that's actually really tied into the greater health of people in Japan. But they don't get up and work like they did when they were 50. They've created essentially a second economic system of part-time work, job sharing, remote work, all things that are sort of different that creates essentially a second work economy. I visited a place called the Silver Genzai Human Resources Organization. There, I knew I'd get human resources into this conversation.
There you go. You nailed it.
They represent 1 million Japanese workers over the age of 60, 65 to 102. And they only place people in part-time work because that's sort of what what older workers want. And they've created essentially an economy that supports what they need, not just what sort of companies think they need.
Yeah. I don't want to leave the conversation about Japan without mentioning that many people will hear you talk about workers in Japan and also talk about some of the unhealthy work cultures and structures in the Japanese economy. So we're wearing them out at a very young age in the Japanese economy. And so when they retire, it's really interesting that they still want to work because I think that some would say is the culture that they were raised in and they feel a certain national obligation to participate. So what do you think about that?
So I think the interesting story about it is, and we've actually gone back to sort of the culture. We talked about how sort of the culture of the U.S. is individualized and how that actually sort of comes and goes with history. And it's the same in Japan, which has sort of, in some ways, the least likely to create a second work economy of part-time work because it is the most, until up about age 60, it's one of the most competitive, hard-driven, suicide-inducing work cultures in the world. So it seems like it was one of the most unlikely places to create sort of this second work economy, which is part-time and much more supportive of older workers. But it did, because a cultural consensus, that's what's good for healthy aging. And frankly, because companies needed older workers more than older workers needed them.
Wait, that's interesting. That's true?
Yeah, because if you look at the traditional labor force in Japan, 18 to 64, that's in decline, right? So birth rates has plunged. It's not as low as Korea, which is like 0.65, but it's low. It's lower than the US. It's like one.
And immigration is low as well. And
non-existent, right? So they need workers. They're losing workers in traditional labor force. So companies, I visited a company, a machine parts company in Toyama. So there's sort of an odd story. And, this was the daughter of the founder was now the CEO, and her father had been like the very traditional CEO. Everyone worked very hard. And then at 64, they kicked him out. And she came to the CEO and she's like, that can't work because I don't have enough workers. And the workers are retiring, the ones who actually know these things. And Toyama is a sort of secondary city, has people moving to Tokyo and Osaka. So they had a terrible labor force. So half the workers are over, 65. They work 3 days a week. They come in at 10. They job share. They just had to reinvent themselves for a super age society. And we're going to get there, but we're not there yet, but we're going to get there.
Hello, this is Michael Vandervoort from the Drive Through HR podcast, where we discuss ideas, trends, and activities that impact HR, talent, HR technology in the workplace. Our focus is on expanding knowledge and igniting curiosity as we hear directly from people who are shaping the future of the HR industry. Join us.
Are you optimistic about when we get there in the United States? Like, you think it's going to happen soon, or you think it's going to be ugly?
So it is ugly, right? So if you take all the data on social engagement, social connection is bad. And it's been bad since the 1980s. We spend more time alone. We have fewer friends. Our relationships with the person closest to us is getting worse. And, I think all the indicators are going in the wrong direction. That makes me a pessimist. But I think the thing is, especially since I've gotten in this space and started writing an advice column and talking to lots of people about it, I see a deep hunger for social connection, for human connection that people recognize as missing in their life. But to your point, Lori, they don't really know what to do with that. And they don't have the institutions that brought us together. Think churches or unions or sewing circles or book clubs or PTAs. They're all lesser than they were. We need to create new institutions that help bring people back together. Work's one, lifelong learning's another, volunteering's another. All those things need to be built up. And we need to have, a civic Marshall Plan, if you will, to really make that happen. Or we're going to just keep going in the wrong direction.
I love that phrase, a civic Marshall Plan. But on the other hand, change begins with us, right? And I think one of the reasons why I wanted you on the pod today was really to challenge the listeners to think about how they can get more involved, if they can, if they have that kind of bandwidth in their lives, to really bring about some social connection, even in their own lives or in the lives of our senior citizens and our elder statesmen and women in this country. One of the real joys in my life, I'm 51 years old, is that I got back involved in my synagogue and I spend time with the older members of our congregation. We get ice cream, we talk, they're playing mahjong, and one of the things I have is a little bit of time and patience and just having the connection and hearing stories and really understanding how they contribute and where they go volunteer is inspiring to me. So it's a mutual two-way street of learning, and I think I'm learning and growing from that experience myself.
Yeah, I love that story, Lori. It's great you're doing that. And one thing I would say is, and I bet you feel like there's actually research. There's a researcher of friendship at the University of Kansas, and his analysis of friendship is that it's mostly a result of proximity. It's not being an extrovert, introvert. It's just being next to people of similar interests enough time, 80 hours to be a friend, 200 hours to be a close friend. So it is doing things like you're doing, which is finding a relationship in your synagogue and being there, and you'll build relationships that way.
Well, you mentioned that you visited a couple other countries, and of course, there are the wonderful countries in Western Europe. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your trips with good food and good wine?
Oh, well, then, so Spain and Italy. And I should say, so I picked the 5 countries, not because they're the longest lived countries in the world, though they're among them, and not because they're the healthiest aging countries in the world, although they're among them. It's because they shouldn't necessarily be. I mean, Spain is one of the poorer countries in the EU. Italy has I think Spain has high smoking rates, as does Japan. relatively high, not American high, but relatively high obesity rates in Italy. And yet they do extraordinarily well. And they have strong systems of social support and social connection. I mean, Italy, the story I wrote about actually had to do with volunteering, which is actually sort of in Italy, kind of invention of the century. Essentially the nonprofit social sector used to be run by the church, then it was run by the government, and they sort of had to create a voluntary sector in the 20th century in Italy when the government couldn't afford it anymore, couldn't afford that social safety net. And it's almost entirely populated by people over the age of 60 and 65. The young old essentially are running the volunteer sector of Italy. And I spent time in what they call senior centers. Actually, two stories. One is senior centers where I couldn't tell who the volunteers and who the sort of the seniors were because they were all over 65. It didn't really seem to matter, right? Because they were all there connecting with each other. And then they went to another town called Bergamo, which is interesting because it was actually the first epicenter of COVID.
Oh, yeah.
And one of the things that you would think after Bergamo, in which thousands died, is that they would like wrap their older folks in bubble wrap and keep them away for their own protection. And what's interesting, they went for an entirely different direction. They disbanded senior centers and recreated them as centers for all ages because there's a stigma to senior centers, and they wanted to bring younger people and older people together. And they've created essentially sort of an intergenerational village that didn't exist 5 years ago. And it's really an extraordinary thing. And it's a vibrant thing that brings people of all generations together.
That's really beautiful. I was thinking about how in America, you mentioned this earlier, that there is an economy that's been created around being a teenager or being in certain life stages. And I think that's probably true in most places around the world. I mean, we always try to monetize the young, right? No matter where you are on the planet. But I wonder why it's easier to create something like an intergenerational center in Italy versus Paducah, Kentucky.
Yeah, so I think it's so this actually goes back to the point you were making, Lori, that there is actually something unique, not irreversible, but something unique about sort of Americans' view of how generations are supposed to break apart at age 18. We're the only place, we have these active aging 55 plus communities. No other part of the world has this idea that you retire and go to this place where there are no other generations allowed. It's sort of a uniquely American thing.
Yeah, but wait, dude, I'm okay with moving somewhere myself at the age of 51 where I don't have to deal with like a Gen Z kid for a little bit. Like, give me that break. I feel like I deserve that in life.
That's a typical view. I have an 18-year-old son who's going to go off to college next year, and I'm sort of sweating it. Like, what is my life without having, that generation involved? I think it's much more typically associated to sort of the cultural norms of the country is like the generations get value out of each other. And there are places in the United States that really reflect that. So for my podcast, I did a season, actually, it's just the season's out now. It's on how we're going to house an aging nation. And I went to one of these 55 plus communities called Latitudes Margaritaville. It's a Jimmy Buffett themed retirement community in Florida. It's great. But then I went to Gorham House in Maine, which is a nursing home and a preschool. And if you ever want to see sort of the joy, that younger children can bring to older folks, go there. But the real interesting story that's not surprising, right? You got to see, you can imagine, Miss Mary, 106 years old with a little kid. But the preschool, this is a story that I love telling because the preschool teacher told me that the thing that's most meaningful to her is when the elementary school teachers in that town told her that the students who come through the Gorham House preschool are the most empathetic and understanding of differences of any kids. It's developmentally really important to them. Like when a kid shows up in a wheelchair, all the other kids don't know what to do with it. These kids know what to do with it. They're used to differences. And that's really developmentally important to the old and the young alike. And that's a value we should recognize more than we do.
Yeah, I do hope they serve those older people margaritas, though, up in Maine. Let's bring the best of both.
That's right. Yeah.
That's how I feel about that. Well, it's been really wonderful kind of going on this journey. I want to know, is there anything you'd like to leave our audience with in terms of your book, key messages? I mean, people who listen are really focused on improving and fixing the world of work. And I think to your earlier point, we are a society that has told ourselves that you should retire at 65, but actually that's not even financially feasible for so many workers these days. So what do you want people to hear?
So let me actually start, if you don't mind me gassing on for another moment, about the retirement age. So the retirement age, do you know where the retirement age of 65 comes from?
No, I don't actually.
Yeah, it was actually invented by Bismarck, Count Prince Otto von Bismarck of Prussia, who was forced by sort of political circumstances to create the first retirement plan in Europe. It's actually a great contribution. But he set at a time when the average age of the German worker, life expectancy was 41, he set the pension plan, the retirement age at 65, because he didn't want to pay it out.
No, I hear you. Like any good politician, right?
Right. So, and that rule that he created in 1880 has sort of been inherited year after year, decade after decade, and become sort of a moral right, right? It was made up by this Prussian aristocrat, and we've now sort of adopted as this rule of life. And you can just hear the history of that to know that why are we doing it that way? Why is 65 endowed with such a moral certainty with it? So I would say to the people who are thinking about the future of work, they're going to need older workers. Our birth rate is declining. We're losing immigrants. The traditional labor force is going to decline. The traditional age labor force will decline. We're going to need older workers, and we're going to have to create opportunities for them. And that's going to be good for older workers, and it's going to be for companies because multi-generational workforces, research has shown, actually are particularly effective ones. Brings together different experiences and wisdoms, which supports work effectiveness.
I'm with you. I'm tracking right along. And then I start to invoke my HR brain, which is dangerous. And I start to think about all the ways that state and local governments have built systems of revenue around the traditional worker and what happens when they turn 65 or what happens when people go part-time, what that means for benefits, right? Our benefit plan. All of this needs to be rethought, reworked. But I like how you think that's possible, that we can be creative, that we can rethink the way we pay people, we engage them, and we actually create a society that's more, I think, rooted in a sense of belonging.
Yeah, we invented the stuff. We can change the stuff for sure. And others are.
I love it. We can uninvent some of the things that we've invented. That's a good lesson. Well, listen, Ken, if people want to learn more about you, your podcast, your book, where do we send them? Where should they go?
Oh, there are a number of places they can go. They can go to my website, longevity-project.com. They can go to wherever books are sold to buy Healthy to 100. They can go to my partners at the Stanford Center on Longevity at Stanford University to find my podcast. They can go to Instagram to find our Grand People channel, which tells stories of people in the second half of life. And they can subscribe to our newsletters about social connection and about aging. So lots of ways to find me and hopefully engage with this great journey of life.
And how long are you going to do this for? Are you planning on retiring? Do you have a date?
That's a fantastic question. I am not. I'm 62, and I'm not planning to retire anytime that I can think of in the future.
Well, we're lucky you're not. The work you're doing is really great and really important. Thank you again for being a guest today.
Thank you, Lori. Love talking with you as always.
Hey, everybody. I hope you enjoyed my chat with Ken Stern. Here are the 3 key takeaways from our conversation. 1, loneliness is a health risk, not just a bad feeling. Disconnection affects your body the same way smoking or a poor diet does. 2, the life stages we take for granted, like school, work, retirement, were invented. They can be reinvented. Countries that have done that are seeing real gains in how long and how well people live. 3, this isn't just personal. The communities and policies around you shape your longevity as much as anything you do on your own. So get political. Find Ken's book, Healthy to 100, at your favorite local bookstore, the library, or online wherever books are sold. And learn more about Ken at longevity-project.com. Punk Rock HR is produced by RepCap. They're a B2B content marketing agency who help organizations tell clear human stories that connect. Whether you need strategy, customer interviews, or full production support, RepCap turns complex ideas into compelling content that moves business forward. Learn more at repcap.com. Punk Rock HR can also be found on the Work Defined podcast network, along with hundreds of other work-focused shows. To listen or learn how to advertise, head on over to workdefined.com. That's WRKdefined.com. And finally, if you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a 5-star review wherever you stream it. It really helps the show. Now that's all for today. I've got some advice for you. Be safe, be kind, and don't sell out.